la la. I would prefer it if you sang, actually.
No, I'm sorry. You're not going to get me singing.
Beautiful sound. Okay. And stand by. Now we're on record. Okay. So we're recording again. The frame is gorgeous. We've got all kinds of tape and probably like 2.5 hours left to parking, and I can edit out anything that you ask me to edit out.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was talking to somebody this weekend who called me off of the anti-polygraph site, who speaks Arabic and is Apache and
as in American Indian.
Indian, and works for the Department of Homeland Security, and interviewed at CIA very recently, and you know, they really reamed him during the polygraph, and it was over peyote. And I said, yeah,
that's a potentially religious discrimination case.
I remembered what you said about that, about the synagogue story.
Yeah.
From your polygraph.
Yep. Yeah, during one of my first polygraphs that I took, they, out of the blue, asked me about where I had traveled. I traveled to Eastern Europe, and they asked if I had visited any places of worship, and I said I went to some Orthodox Christian churches, and they said no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about did you visit any synagogues? And I had no idea why that was relevant. I'm Jewish. Other than that, I don't know what the relevance is. I don't think they asked that of Irish Catholics visiting churches, or I don't know.
Right. So you had mentioned that your first polygraph was very easy.
Yep. Because I had no foreknowledge of the questions, so I just answered instinctively. I think the problem with the polygraph is when you have time to think about the questions in advance, when you know the questions, which typically happens after you've already taken a polygraph, that's when you start to think about nuances of the questions. And if you don't look at things exactly in black and white, then you won't pass the polygraph. And I use the term pass loosely because there really is no passing and failing. There's just reactions. And contrary to what some people would have you believe, there is no failing of the polygraph. It just measures your anxiety to particular questions.
Do you think that there could be larger effects on institutional cultures if they're screening out people who are sensitive to ambiguity?
You know, it's a really good, interesting question. Yes, I think you are absolutely right, and I think you've picked up on a facet of the polygraph that most people don't pick up on. I think people who tend to be really critical, nuanced thinkers do not do well on the polygraph. People who tend to view the world in black and white, who tend to do well, and I would also say people who, this might sound a little bit dramatic, but I think people who have somewhat warped consciences also tend to do well on the polygraph, and that might sound kind of counterintuitive, but you look at history and you look, they've never caught a spy through the polygraph, and you think, well, why is that? These are people who should have huge things weighing on their conscience, huge things that should come out in a heartbeat on the polygraph, but they don't. And I think people like that are really convinced that the things they've done are not bad, and that suggests there's something a little amiss with their brain chemistry. And I think people who have something a little amiss with their brain chemistry often do well on the polygraph. They don't have those sort of nagging doubts that I think more incisive, nuanced thinkers have. And if you were to analyze, I would venture that if you were to analyze each of the questions that they ask, that a typical agency would ask someone during the polygraph, when you really think about it, it's very hard to answer yes or no. It is. For example, one of the questions that they ask in the course of an interview has to do with, at least that they asked during one of my polygraphs, this was many years ago, and it was a prevalent question at that time, was about deviant sexual behavior. Well, what does that mean? You know, in I think most states in America, relatively common sexual acts are still considered illegal, such as sodomy, and in theory, probably 99% of Americans under that definition would be guilty of deviant sexual acts. Well, I don't think that's what the CIA polygraphers were getting at. But my point is, if you really think about these questions, they're very ambiguous, they're very gray, and they're not designed for people who think in terms of gray, because you don't do well.
How do you think that type of questioning, the sexual history line of questioning, does it affect male and female applicants in the same way?
I would say no. I think there is, there's, as I understand it, the agency can no longer officially discriminate against someone in getting a job based on his or her sexuality. In reality, I don't know if that's a factor. It might be. And I would venture, and this is just my speculation, but I would venture that it is more of a concern. I would say, off the top of my head, it seems to be more of a concern for men than for women. Possibly because one of the ostensible concerns the agency might have with someone's sexuality is the potential for blackmail. And that's often a concern with these questions, is there something you're hiding that someone could blackmail you about? And so I think it might be perceived, and I could be wrong, but that a male homosexual is more susceptible to blackmail than perhaps a female homosexual. I don't know, this is just me speculating. But only because I don't know, I guess maybe society is somewhat more accepting of female homosexuality. I don't know. I'm also basing this on just anecdotes I've heard from male friends who have had polygraphers insinuate perhaps things about their sexuality, and I haven't heard similar stories from women about that. So it's not to say it doesn't happen.
You had mentioned something about the rate of divorce in OS as it related to the blackmail threat.
OS, are you referring to?
The behaviors of adultery and alcoholism, and how these things are sort of in a protected category, or even encouraged.
It is. It's interesting too, because you look at, there are certain kind of hallmarks of a potential traitor in an organization. Alcoholism. I mean, these are kind of the textbook indicators that someone might be betraying his or her country. You know, they have a huge alcohol problem. Infidelity might go in that category if it's something that would rise to the level of blackmail. Again, it goes to, would this person share secrets, betray their country so that their infidelity was not revealed to their spouse. These are all huge what I would call red flags. The irony at the agency is that those are the red flags the agency ignores. Those are pretty much swept under the rug. Alcoholism is rampant, particularly in the Directorate of Operations. Infidelity is rampant, particularly in the Directorate of Operations. Far from being seen as a potential liability, it's par for the course, and there's very much an old boys network at the CIA. It's very much Caucasian, very much middle age, very much male, and among that group, there's certain traits that are really prevalent, and if you don't quite fit into that mold, it's actually almost a liability. So if you don't drink with the boys, if you don't, if you have a stable marriage and maybe are not as unfaithful, then that's also, that's a little bit against the grain. That's not quite the typical officer in the Directorate of Operations. So, but ironically, these are the things that you would think the CIA should be concerned about. In reality, they're not, and the people who end up not doing well on the polygraphs, I would say it's not necessarily problems like that, the kind of problems you would think they would look for.
It's so interesting that you would mention race, because there's this leaked Department of Defense Polygraph Institute report from 1990 on antipolygraph.org that mentions that deceptive, innocent blacks in an experiment in this training program at Dogfight were substantially more likely to be incorrectly deemed deceptive than innocent whites. And so
it's very, the whole judgment process, the whole adjudication process, the process of quote unquote passing or failing the polygraph is it's very multi-tiered and subjective. It begins when a polygrapher actually tests a subject, but then it goes to someone adjudicating that and looking at the results. A polygraph is comprised not just of your physiological reactions, but it's also based on the polygrapher's judgments of you and perhaps your body language, perhaps your degree of eye contact. There are any number of factors, and these are things you could probably look up on the web as well. They've been around for decades. How can you determine a person is lying? Everyone wants to know that. And so it's an entirely subjective process, and that's why I could see why a study like that showing that that you said innocent blacks were more often labeled as deceptive than whites. I could see how that could happen because there is such room for subjectivity, and there's such room for just frankly bias, prejudice, anti-Semitism. I mean, you name it. It's such a discretionary process that there is that room for innocent people to be falsely labeled deceptive. I mean, there are just so many false positives in the polygraph. It's also a very opaque process, which means that, and this is also interesting in relation to the study, there's not a lot you can do when you don't quote unquote pass a polygraph. You have very limited recourses, and ultimately, if your last recourse is the U.S. court system. And courts, as a general rule, will not second-guess national security decisions, particularly clearance decisions. So you're really limited in being able to hold agencies accountable for what goes on within the polygraph process. It's almost impossible. And to the extent you can, I could also see how people in a certain demographic group would be less able to do that because perhaps they don't have the resources to do so, because you really do. I mean, even to take it to a certain level, which is not very far, you have to have money, and you have to have connections and resources. I mean, you have to hire an attorney. You don't have to, but these are steps that increase your chances of overturning an unfavorable polygraph result. So again, I mean, it's just a very opaque, subjective process.
Let's see. In terms of checks and balances that might exist, either in reality or in theory, to ensure that this is not a piece of the screening process for pre-employment or for employees, or even in forensic settings when law enforcement uses the polygraph, to ensure that this is not purely a discretionary tool that's a vehicle to legitimate these sorts of biases. You had mentioned you had a really good adjudicator, that you didn't know if they have those anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, they do have adjudicators still. At the CIA at least, there is the check and balance of the polygraph is the adjudicator. The polygrapher's role is to extract a confession from you, plain and simple. That's their role, whether you have one or not. But the adjudicator has a different role. The adjudicator looks at the results of the polygraph, takes it with a grain of salt, and also looks at every other piece of information in your background investigation. So in theory, they look at the whole picture. They understand, hey, the polygrapher had this goal. This is the polygrapher's perspective. But what do I, as a normal person viewing all the evidence, think? And that's an okay process. That's actually a reasonable process. But a couple things. One, I actually think that process has become somewhat perverted over the years. My sense, having been in the agency, is that adjudicators no longer have that sort of objective third-party view that they once did. That they more closely mirror the views of the polygrapher. And I don't know if that's a reflection of our overall national security priorities, if it's a reflection of the leadership at the agency in particular. I just don't know. But that's been generally my experience. People, in my experience, have had more problems with the polygraph over the years I've been there. And that's just my layperson's view. I don't have any statistics for that.
They won't release them, so.
I'm sure they will not. And I don't have them. I don't know what they are. I mean, those would be pretty squirrely statistics as well. I don't know. Again, because there's no pass and there's no fail. But the other question, there was something else. About adjudicator being a check and a balance. I would also say that even best case scenario, even assuming the adjudicator does his or her job properly, that's still only an internal process. It's really not a third party in the true sense of the word. There is no external adjudicative body that can review the results. There is no outside agency, and again, no court of law will really second guess a security clearance determination or denial. So even at best, it's an imperfect process. I mean, imagine a world where we had no court system, where we left, say, the executive branch to judge the legality of its own policies, and our only guarantee for its fairness was, well, the executive branch has a specially designated office to review its own policies. Well, okay, it's a step, but really in the long run that wouldn't fly, as our founding fathers presciently realized that we really need external checks and balances. And unfortunately, while the role of an adjudicator in theory is a good first step, it's just not practical because it's still the same organization. There's no external review, and that's a big problem. Courts, I wish courts would be more willing to look at the merits of security clearance determinations, which they're not, because unfortunately it just leaves open huge potential for abuse, the fact that they're unwilling to examine these processes.
You mentioned that I think it was the Office of Security had told you in relation to your EO complaint that Title VII of the Equal Opportunity...
The 1964 Civil Rights Act, yeah.
Right. Does not apply. That's
right. I was told, I had filed a complaint based on security's treatment, what I viewed was disparate treatment of me based on my faith, which is Jewish, in part based on the questions they had asked me even from my earliest polygraphs about synagogues I had attended when I had traveled. Really questions that I felt were inappropriate, irrelevant, and different from what they asked other ethnic or racial or religious groups. And again, there were other things later on. I'm trying to think of what I can talk about here. At one point during my employment, I believe I faced systematic retaliation for exercising my First Amendment rights in the form of writing my book. One of the things they did as part of this retaliation was to also question my father, who holds a clearance through the CIA. He worked for a company that did contracts for the government, and accordingly the CIA held his clearances. So as yet another tool that they used against me, they questioned my father, and they asked him about his service for the Israeli Defense Forces, which had occurred more than 40 years before the interview. And my father served. He's a U.S. citizen. He was born a U.S. citizen. And in about 1967, he was in Europe and volunteered. The Six-Day War broke out, and he was a young, perhaps naive, recent graduate, and he decided to go to Israel and on a whim, and he ended up serving a few years in the Israeli Defense Forces. Years later, he got a job that required a clearance. He fully disclosed the information. There was no issue. People can serve in foreign armies and still get a U.S. security clearance. It's really not prohibitive at all. And it was not only prohibitive when he got his clearance. It was not prohibitive for the entire 27 years he held his clearance. There were no issues at all. He had no foreign contacts. He kept in touch with no one from Israel. Yet, in the course of the CIA's actions against me, they raised a lot of issues relating to my religion that were just wholly irrelevant and inappropriate, I felt. And one of the things they did was they called my father in and they questioned him about his service for the Israeli Defense Forces, which had occurred more than 40 years ago. And I raise that as another example of, I think, the CIA's sort of inappropriate assumptions about people based on their race or religion or ethnicity. They look for vulnerabilities, even those that aren't there. But they make inappropriate assumptions when they do that. And they focus more on certain ethnic groups or certain religious groups. I think the same is probably true of Muslims. I would venture that that Muslims are also considered highly suspect, even when the evidence doesn't warrant that conclusion. And I have found that to be the case with members of the Jewish faith as well. That there is a sort of irrational belief that members of the Jewish faith have a connection or loyalty to Israel. That's really mythical. It just doesn't exist. And I have no other explanation for it than sort of latent anti-Semitism. And again, just a general mistrust of foreigners and people of different ethnic groups and races and religions.
Right, and that distrust is not latent when it turns into, it sounds like you were called in for a string of 3 polygraphs. On 2 different occasions. Right.
Exactly. I mean, I took that first polygraph. I had no problems. And then subsequently, my initial polygraph had actually expired. It's a sort of an administrative process. Your polygraph has to be current within a certain period of time when you start work. So it was an administrative issue. It was no big deal. But I had to come in to redo the polygraph, even though I had passed the first one. And that second time when I came in for the polygraph, it took me 3 polygraphs to quote unquote pass. And then, although reportedly I did pass on the 3rd, although again it's a sort of meaningless term to say that. But then I did also take 2 polygraphs 5 years later about 5 years later when I was up for my reinvestigation. CIA employees are periodically reinvestigated every 5 years. So you have the polygraph to look forward to every 5 years. And supposedly it keeps people on their toes. It probably does. You were asking about checks and balances.
We can.
Okay.
We're good. Let's see. When you say that it keeps people on their toes, I can see that piece of the process having positive and negative effects on morale, in the sense that maybe it has a deterrent effect that we just haven't been able to measure.
Well, I think it's a wholly negative effect. I don't think there's any positive effect in terms of deterrence or effect on people's behavior of the polygraph for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at the spies throughout history, not only did they pass the polygraphs, but they sure didn't seem to be deterred by the polygraphs. So I would say that that's really the deterrent. The deterrent effect is speculative at best. I would also say that consider the negative effect on behavior of the polygraph. I mean, you hear jokes all the time. In the agency, you would hear a joke. If someone accidentally, stole a pen or something just wholly innocuous, people would make jokes that, oh my gosh, I gotta report this because it's gonna be on my mind for the next polygraph, which sounds funny enough and it sounds lighthearted enough, but actually people walk around with a very sort of deep sense of paranoia and distrust of each other. And that's deliberate. I mean, that culture is deliberate. That's very much a part of the CIA culture. When I first started work, we received an orientation from security, and to this day, I still remember I think it was the chief of security talking to us saying, after you come into work on a Monday, ask your cubicle neighbors how their weekend was, and if he or she says it wasn't very good, take note of that. Take note, because that person could be a potential traitor. And to this day, I remember her admonition. I remember her telling this to brand new employees. It was our first week of work, and I was completely reviled by that prospect that people are not even allowed to say they had a bad weekend without being viewed as a potential traitor. But it was really, I thought, emblematic of the kind of culture at the CIA. I mean, you are always distrustful of the people around you, always. Everyone is a potential informant. It's very much, without going overboard, it's very much reminiscent of almost the Stalinist system, where which really thrived on distrust, on people distrusting each other, even at the highest levels. And you completely see that at the agency. No one trusts each other, even at the highest levels. I mean, you see that for every now and then. You kind of catch a glimpse in the media when they talk about these scandals. For example, Jose Rodriguez's destruction of the videotapes, allegedly showing torture, and this was a controversy that came up a year or so ago. And when you read the account of what happened, Jose Rodriguez claims that the Office of General Counsel, which is comprised of attorneys, gave him permission to destroy these videotapes. Porter Goss, who was the director at the time, claimed that he was not aware. And you look at kind of what's going on between the lines, and you think of this and you think, what kind of organization is this where, no one's willing to take responsibility, no one trusts each other. Apparently, Jose Rodriguez, if you believe his account and Goss's account, didn't even tell the director of the agency, his boss. I mean, that's really kind of a dysfunctional organization and a supremely distrustful organization. And it's a deeply set culture of the agency, and it starts at the top.
Right.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this from a sort of neophyte grad student perspective is that in the political economy literature, you see more and more how the benefits of trust and the costs of distrust, you can quantify these things in international trade. This is money and this is security. Trust is really serious business.
You are totally right. And I often say that if the CIA were a private organization, it would have long ago gone out of business. It would have gone bankrupt. I mean, we could not function. The private sector does not tolerate that level of waste, fraud, and abuse. It just doesn't. And like you said, distrust contributes to that too. One of my friends in law enforcement once pointed something out to me that I thought was very insightful. She said, the purpose of a warrant is twofold. One, it's to protect the rights of the accused, but two, it ensures that law enforcement doesn't waste its resources on the wrong things. Law enforcement has to get its ducks in order. They have to think about, who do we really want to focus on? Who do we have enough evidence to actually target? Who can we write up a good proposal for a warrant? And it avoids law enforcement, just to use this example, from the shotgun effect, which is throwing resources at everything all the time, which helps no one. I mean, that's really a disservice to taxpayers and to our national security. And the same is true. I mean, it's the same argument that when you're so distrustful, you fire that shotgun at everyone, and you waste a lot of resources distrusting people, and it's counterproductive. And I mean, it would be interesting. I'm sure this is not public, and I certainly don't have this information, but it'd be interesting to know what percentage of resources the CIA devotes to security and counterintelligence, and within its own organization, because there's also counterintelligence with respect to foreigners that we might work with, which is a different ballgame. But it'd be interesting, and my guess would be that it is far disproportionate to what it should be. That we waste a lot of resources doing that at the expense of the mission. I mean, at root, we have limited resources. I mean, we just can't go after everyone. And if we are going after our own, if the CIA goes after its own internal employees, those are terrorists that it can't go after. And you would be surprised, or maybe not, but I would venture that the CIA takes internal threats more seriously than external threats, and I really believe that. I really do, which is a shame, because I don't think that's warranted, and I think it's counterproductive.
You have hit the nail on the head with one of the big arguments on the other side, which is that the polygraph is important because yeah, there are a lot of false positives,
Mhm.
but you increase that number to decrease false negatives, and so this shakes out to a choice. We have to make a choice
Yep.
between individual liberty and national security, and gee, we just want what's best for America.
Right. And I think that's a false calculus, first of all. And second of all, I see a danger in that, which is over reliance on the polygraph. And I mean, I personally, I think it's just unacceptable to have that many false positives in order to get the elusive traitor in the midst. I just think that there would be an unacceptable amount of false positives. And I'm not even convinced you would ever get that traitor because, as I've said, the polygraph does not have a good history of detecting traitors. So it's not even clear that that is a calculus, that it is a trade-off. It might be a false calculus. That said, I also see the danger of believing, as these intelligence agencies do, unfortunately, that the polygraph is essentially what's the word? Irrefutable. It can't. There's no room for error. I mean, people really still attach that myth to the polygraph, and unfortunately, what that does is I think it leaves agencies blind to often common sense both ways. Meaning, here's an employee who's outstanding, who has really no other red flags except perhaps a bad polygraph test. I mean, the polygraph blinds the agency to all the good things in that employee's background. Conversely, I think people are the agency's willing to overlook a lot of really bad things, perhaps in a person's past, if he or she passes the polygraph. And again, pass is an interesting word, but it's not an appropriate word. But if they don't have a reaction on the polygraph. And I think that was true of a lot of the traitors. I believe Aldrich Ames, if I'm not mistaken, quote unquote passed the polygraph, but the agency was blind to a lot of other factors in his case. And I think part of it is that there are a lot of, like we were saying before, there are a lot of red flags in security in the case of a potential traitor. Alcoholism, infidelity, various other there are various other causes for blackmail. I'm trying to think where I was going with this. I forgot. But a lot of these things are just so rampant in the Directorate of Operations. For example, alcoholism, as I mentioned before, really rampant. And to actually investigate that as a potential vulnerability would really be embarrassing for the agency and sort of a betrayal. I think that people in the agency would feel it's a betrayal because it's part of the code of the agency. It's part of this code that everyone sort of, no one talks about, but everyone knows it. And there are certain things that everyone's aware, but no one's going to admit. And to really start, if they were to start going after people who had an alcohol problem, who had an infidelity problem, I mean, the agency would be gutted. And I don't say that facetiously. I say that quite literally. And that no agency, the CIA would never be willing to do that. It would be unbelievably embarrassing. And it's much easier to focus on a machine that comes up with black and white answers. Yes, no, ostensibly.
This hits on sort of the other big polygraph proponent argument, which is, well, the box isn't perfect, but if you take it away, then we have no other independent credibility assessment tool that's as good as this, and that's code for a lie detector, right?
Right.
And it seems like the myth of the pseudoscience has overtaken the reality in the policy calculation.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think that, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Go back to the last thing you said. Repeat it.
Independent credibility assessment. They're very attached to polygraph as an independent credibility assessment tool. Saying, well, if you take it away, what are we going to replace it with?
Right, and that's ridiculous. I mean, one of my first polygraphs that I took, the adjudicator, who was quite good, and incidentally, perhaps not coincidentally, he's since left the agency, but he at the time had told me that, you know, the polygraph is just a tool. It's only as good as the person giving the polygraph. And he compared it to a weapon, that, you know, a gun is completely effective in the hands of someone who knows how to fire it, completely ineffective in the hands of someone who doesn't. So to that extent, I would say it's really not an independent. First of all, it's not an independent gauge of someone's veracity. I mean, what is independent when it completely depends on the polygrapher? And it wildly varies according to the training of the polygrapher. The results vary according to the training of the polygrapher, according to the chemistry between the test subject and the polygrapher. You know, there are all kinds of things that one can do to try to change the result, or to try to ensure accurate results in the polygraph. One is an old time tested trick is to have the tester mirror the subject, both physically, ethnically, gender-wise. That's considered, you know, a way to make the subject feel more comfortable. But what that says to me is, what kind of process is this? That where the accuracy of the results depends on what the person looks like and how much the subject feels that the tester, you know, mirrors the person. I mean, that's kind of a squirrely sounding test to me. But that's what they do. I mean, those are the kind of things that influence the accuracy. So I don't think it's an independent. I don't think it's an independent gauge of veracity. I think it'd be far more effective to rely on the sort of tried and true indices of a person's veracity, which are background investigations, talking to people who know the person, and talking to people who don't know the person. And I mean, that used to be much more the standard procedure. I think the reliance on polygraphs has increased over the years. But there are any number of indicators: finances, lifestyle, and I'm not opposed to asking the same questions that, generally speaking, more or less asking the same questions that one might ask during a polygraph. I'm opposed to using the results of the test to mean anything. So if someone admits in the polygraph, yeah, I was involved in a terrorist attack, well, sure, you're going to hold that against them. You're not going to hire them. You're going to prosecute them. Sure. But so as far as, you know, the verbal confessions go, that's one thing. But the actual results of the test really are meaningless. And unfortunately, that's what agencies rely on. It's not really oftentimes what people say. It's the actual result, which is highly inaccurate. And in theory, the CIA, all the intelligence agencies, I believe, are not allowed to either not hire someone or to fire someone based solely on the results of the polygraph. In other words, there has to be something more. They have to have said something, an investigation has to uncover something, but the results alone are not supposed to be dispositive. That said, it happens all the time. All the time. And it's one of the worst injustices, I think, surrounding the polygraph. And no one really holds these agencies accountable for that. It happens all the time. And a lot of times, I think even if people did understand the policies and fight those kind of determinations, I think those are very hard things to prove, because the second you open your mouth to say anything, well, the agency can use what you've said against you, as opposed to the actual results of the polygraph, even if what you've said is very innocuous, which also happens all the time. So it is a hard thing to prove that, oh, this agency relied exclusively on the results of the polygraph. But like I said, it happens all the time, and I know of many instances in which it's happened. Numerous instances.
I feel like the non-transparency, I mean, as horrifying as that is,
Yeah.
the non-transparency element is worse, because if you just came along and replaced the polygraph with something else, with a conversation, where it was like completely fake,
Right.
you know, and nothing was really hooked up to anything, and it
Right.
was just completely an interrogation tool,
Right.
you would still have the problem of, I don't want to say translation, it's a telephone game.
Right.
Where if you say something and a polygrapher transcribes it and an adjudicator reads
Right.
what a polygrapher transcribes, how many layers of quality control can you go through
Right.
without anybody actually knowing what you said. And
Right.
this has happened
No, it's an interesting
at
point.
the CIA, right? There was Operation Bad Apples in the 90s that actually uncovered instances of this where confessions had been made up.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, polygraph charts had been falsified, and it looked like people weren't passing, and the polygraphers thought, well, this person is telling the truth. So it still would be so non-transparent because security is exempt.
I think you're right. I mean, unfortunately, that there's that potential for sort of misconstruction of words throughout the clearance process, not just a polygraph, whether you hook someone up or not. I mean, either way, you're going to interview people. You always interview the subject. You always interview people who know them, maybe people who don't know them as well. So there's always that potential that that the investigator is going to misconstrue something you say, whether you're hooked up to a machine, whether it's in the context of those same questions or not. So it is a problem. I mean, I think certainly the polygraph process exacerbates that. I mean, one obvious solution is to videotape all the interviews, which I believe a lot of agencies do. Now, actually, reviewing those videotapes, if you dispute what transpired, is another story. I think that's virtually impossible. So the check and balance, as it were, is not really a check and balance. It's a check and balance for the agencies, not for the subjects. So it's a good point that there are. The agency has every tool at its disposal to use against you, and you have no tools whatsoever to hold it accountable. Certainly, the agency, if there's any dispute, if there's any question to be resolved against you, they can go back on the videotape and say, "Oh no, you said this. This person has to go." But is that videotape available to you? If you say, "No, I never said that. This is a misconstruction of what I said," no, the videotape is not available to the subjects of the interviews. As far as I know, I've never heard of that, and I have known people who've tried and been unsuccessful in getting it. So you're right. It's a completely one-sided process. I think I mentioned to you on the phone that it's interesting, given the inaccuracy of the polygraph, that I think the best estimates, the best science shows that it's slightly more than 50% accurate, which is a coin flip, because either you're lying or you're not, according to the polygraph. So, I mean, it's literally like a coin flip. And, I mentioned that you have to take a drug test for most positions with clearances in the government. And I cannot imagine the public outcry if a drug test were only 50% accurate or 60% accurate, whatever. If it were anything less than probably 99% accurate, the public would be up in arms. Imagine someone with a 75% accurate test who tests positive for drugs, who wasn't on drugs. I mean, the lawsuits would be flooding the government, and you'd hear a lot of people very angry. But for some reason, the polygraph doesn't cause that same uproar, and I don't know why, and I've thought about this for years, because it's so woefully inaccurate. It's not admissible in a court of law. It's less accurate than forms of evidence that are not very accurate that are admissible. For example, handwriting analysis, which I believe is admissible under some circumstances, but is not particularly accurate. But even the polygraph is less accurate than that. And yet, the government relies so heavily on that. They don't rely on things like handwriting analysis, but they rely on the polygraph. And I don't know why. And I think I've thought about this for years, and I think that it almost has to do with human nature and just the desire of humans to think that they're God, that they can know what's going on through people's minds, that they can read people's thoughts. I mean, it's the one thing that's sort of eluded mankind. We can never know what another person is thinking. And I'm getting a little philosophical here, but you can never know what someone is thinking, and it's frustrating, and it's everyone's worst fear. What's the other person thinking? Do they not like me? Are they gonna betray our country? Are they gonna do any number of things? And we desperately want to know that, and we cling to the illusion that we can, and we can't. And we, as a nation, have been unwilling to accept that. And unfortunately, the consequences are disastrous. I think someday we will look back on the use of the polygraph as something akin to the Salem witch hunt, which is the evidence of the polygraph is as inaccurate as these hysterical girls of Salem, Massachusetts, who would literally label people witches at their whim. And I think it's unfortunately that bad and that unjust. And I think I also mentioned that that I had read for a paper that I had done in law school that the best estimates, best science shows that the polygraph is slightly more than 50% accurate. My adjudicator, when I first began to take the polygraph, had told me that the polygraph was 66% accurate. This is coming from the CIA's mouth. This was my adjudicator, who I mentioned has since left the agency, perhaps not coincidentally, I don't know. But he said it was 66% accurate, which is woefully inaccurate. I mean, even assuming, and that's like I said, that's the agency's estimate, which you might be a little bit higher than what an independent scientific group might say. But and when I started working at the agency, that first week, the briefing I received, I actually raised concerns about the polygraph and its use and the fact that it was so inaccurate. And the security officer at the time told me that no, in fact, 66% was an inaccurate figure, that it's 73% accurate. And that was his figure, which raised two thoughts in my mind. One, that 73% is not particularly accurate either. And again, consider a drug test that was 73% accurate. That would never fly with the American public, with the pool of potential applicants for government jobs. That would never pass muster. But number two, my second thought was that the agency doesn't even know how accurate it is, because I'd gotten two different figures in the course of a few weeks, 66% and 73%. That's a pretty substantial difference. So I don't even think the agency knows how accurate it is, other than that it's not particularly accurate.
Yeah. What about foreign intelligence services, countermeasure training programs, or other intelligence services using the polygraph on their own people? Do we have evidence that either of these things exists?
Yeah, I had heard, and I don't know if this is true, but I think, or I had read in open sources that that even the Soviets, which are the most, this is under the Soviet Union, that were the most supremely distrustful, I would imagine, intelligence service or government that probably existed or up there, that even they didn't polygraph their own employees. The intelligence services did not polygraph their own employees. I don't know if that's true or not. I had I think read that in an open source, which says a lot, I think, because the Soviets, I think, would not hesitate to use different measures to ensure conformity and to weed out dissenters. But apparently, I can only imagine they found it was unproductive. I don't think they would have hesitated from a moral standpoint to use the polygraph. I certainly think they would have had no compunctions about that. So my only conclusion is that they didn't do it because it proved to be just a waste and counterproductive. Which, you know, what does that suggest about the U.S. government, which actually, in addition to using a counterproductive tool, should have moral compunctions? I mean, I think we are better than the Soviet system of government. We are a democracy. I think we are the greatest country on earth, and I think we should have compunctions about using a device like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can't speak about other countries. I remember reading something about the Soviets, but I can't speak about other countries. Is this okay? Am I getting sorry? Is this,
yeah.
It keeps falling.
I'll get up and do a sound check. It's really easy to check.
I hope I'm, because it moved
stop.
over early on, so I feel bad if it's.
The bars, just as you're talking now, are going all the way up to the middle and a little bit farther over, which
So
is
that's
as good sound quality as
Okay.
I usually get.
Okay.
So
Good.
don't worry about
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you for.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just
No.
didn't wanna-
I wanted to check the frame because I bumped it a little while
Oh,
ago
okay.
and you were saying something.
You can interrupt
great,
me.
and I was
Feel
like,
free to. No, feel free to interrupt me.
I was thinking about when the polygraph was used during the Cold War by the U.S. to weed out communists and gays, because the gays were considered a threat,
Yes.
specifically during
Yes.
the Cold War, I guess after Philby, or I don't know. You know,
Yes.
there's like a whole mythology behind that.
Yes.
But I was wondering if that falls under political discrimination, because you know, at Oak Ridge in the
Yeah.
50s, they used the polygraph briefly, and
Yeah.
they shut it down because it was like people were being thrown out for believing in public housing.
Yeah.
So you have to ask, how are you defining communism? Where's the line between communism and socialism and democratic socialism?
Right.
And if you believe in the public option, are you a communist? If you believe in public education.
It's a great point. It's a great point. It's funny you say that, because there are guidelines, and I don't know when they were implemented, and it might have been in response to sort of the Red Scare of the 1950s, and a lot of what you're talking about. There were guidelines implemented by, I believe, the American Polygraph Association, and I can pull these up for you later if you want. But they actually prohibit drawing conclusions discriminating based on political beliefs. That's one, among other things, among race, religion, etc. And I think it would absolutely be a violation if the government were to question someone about his or her political beliefs, even in a roundabout fashion, and to draw security conclusions based on those political beliefs, based solely on those political beliefs, I should say. I do believe that's a violation, and I also think that happens. And I do, and I mean, there are ways of getting at people's political beliefs without coming right out and asking people. I think in some ways, the polygrapher's question of me, having to do with my Jewish faith and whether I visited synagogues, I think in a roundabout way might have been construed as a political question, as, you know, what are my politics when it comes to Israel, and in fact, I actually voiced that concern during my polygraph. I said, you know, I'm Jewish and I'm pro-Israel, and I assume that's not going to be a liability because I'm allowed to be Jewish and pro-Israel in the United States. I'm not breaking any rules, and I don't have divided loyalties. My loyalty is to the United States, and I raised those concerns, and I think those. My view is those concerns were treated as potential vulnerabilities. That the fact that I had mentioned that I was pro-Israel, I think they took note of that, and it was actually I had raised that concern, and it was in the subsequent polygraph when they asked me about the synagogues I had visited. So I think that question was in direct response to me saying openly that I'm Jewish, I'm pro-Israel, and I assume that's not going to be an issue.
So you literally worked as an undercover CIA operative in Baghdad and were commended several times for doing work that was essential to national security that directly saved lives there.
Yeah, I should note that I worked as a case officer, which is fancy language for a spy, for 6 years, and I spent 1 year working as a spy in Baghdad, Iraq. I did receive an award, but it was not from the agency, it was from the military. So
you received a military commendation for
Correct.
saving lives in Iraq.
Correct, yeah.
And how did the agency respond to that?
It was sort of unimportant to the agency. I think, again, the important things in the Directorate of Operations, which is where I worked, merit takes on a whole new meaning. Employees are really not evaluated on the merits. The Director of Operations, to give you sort of a snapshot, is very much based on personal relationships. It's based on, for lack of a better term, schmoozing and how well you get along with certain managers. It's unfortunately much like the business of spying. The kind of people that end up in the Director of Operations, there's a fine line between the work they do overseas and the work they do, the way they interact with their colleagues at the agency, which is that, you know, spying is largely it's largely a job of persuasion and personal relationships and winning people over, and those same techniques really translate into the Directorate of Operations back here in the United States, and so unfortunately what develops is a culture of it's a very sort of superficial culture where merit sort of gets lost in the shuffle, and also it raises the question: a case officer's job is spying. Well, how do you become a good spy? You're good at deceiving people. You're good at persuading people. I mean, these are traits that are really not included in most people's definition of merit. I mean, these are, you ask someone, well, what is a good performer? It's maybe someone with a good education, who is maybe a good writer, who can think clearly, and those are not necessarily the traits that make a good case officer. So what you see, people are evaluated by different standards. So when I got the award from the military, I was hugely honored, because I held the military in the highest respect, and I felt like I had developed a good relationship with the military, and was being recognized for that. I don't think the agency necessarily viewed it as the same kind of accomplishment that I did, and again, because the director of operations has certain benchmarks for progress and for quote-unquote merit, that don't necessarily align with what you might think. You might think someone getting an award would be looked on very favorably, but what's looked on more favorably is how well you build personal relationships within the director of operations, and that's actually I'd say of supreme importance.
It sounds almost like a formalized good old boy system where the benchmarks that have been institutionalized are, this is in a sense favoring venality and favoring clientelism over, what would be in the public interest.
Yeah, exactly. And there's not the director of operations doesn't do a good job of just rewarding people who meet certain sort of basic benchmarks, like I was saying. And it goes along with the fact that, I was talking about how alcoholism is a real problem and infidelity is rampant. But again, these sort of come with the territory of being a case officer. Oftentimes when you are doing your job as a case officer, you drink. You meet with a lot of sort of unsavory people, and you're deployed to other countries, often without your spouse. These are all conditions that are sort of conducive to all the really unpleasant societal characteristics like alcoholism, infidelity, deception, debauchery. These are really kind of unsavory things, but that are not only part of the job of a CIA case officer, but really have become part of the culture of the director of operations. And you almost can't thrive in that environment if you don't have those characteristics, if you don't do those things. And that's the really unfortunate part. And it's also, I think, what contributes to just the culture of total deception at the CIA. And I don't want to sound like a radical, but you look at the history of the agency, and you look even recently at Jose Rodriguez's destruction of these videotapes and the fact that he hid it from Congress, and that he hid it from his own boss, the director, Porter Goss, and you just see again what I was saying before, just a supremely distrustful, deceptive organization. Historically, that has time and again lied to Congress, lied to the American people. That's what prompted the Church and Pike hearings, that's what's prompted some of the more recent congressional investigations. And it's not a good culture. And I would say also that the CIA is different from other organizations in the sense that it is the most secret, with the possible exception of NSA. But when you talk about Department of Defense or State Department or even the executive branch, those organizations are not shrouded in multiple layers of secrecy the way the CIA is. And that's why the CIA is really anomalous. And I think it gets away with things that the other agencies don't for that reason. And I think largely because of that. Even the CIA's budget is classified. So, that's how shrouded in secrecy that is. The Department of Defense, by contrast, not only is its budget not classified, but really it's an overt organization overall. And so when you have those sort of multiple layers of secrecy surrounding the CIA, what you get is just this culture of just total impunity and unaccountability, where it can get away with things that other agencies cannot get away with. And it's built up over the years. I think it would take decades to undo. And I think that's really what distinguishes it from other agencies. Just to talk about an example, a couple years, maybe it was about a year ago, I believe it was, I'm going to get the name wrong. There's an agency. It's, I think, part of the Department of Energy. It's an oil and gas agency, maybe, within the Department of Energy. I'm probably getting the details wrong, but they're responsible for oil and gas policy or something like that. And I don't know if you remember this, but this was maybe a year ago. There was a huge scandal because a lot of these executives, a lot of the government officials in this agency were hobnobbing with these oil and gas executives. And they talked about, there were specific, I think, some specific firms. I won't say because I'll probably get it wrong and then I'll be sued for slander. But it was some of these big oil and gas companies specifically that were identified. And the allegations were that these government officials had inappropriate relationships, sexual relationships. They'd given gifts. There had been gifts exchanged, and that there was this culture of just total debauchery and partying and sex and drugs. And I mean, it was that, and it made the headlines at the time, and it prompted, I believe, congressional investigation, some kind of government investigation. Perhaps it was an internal investigation. And I think actually the interesting thing about the story that I found, I think the trigger for the whole expose was a whistleblower. I think someone on the inside blew the whistle to, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it was the Inspector General of the Department of Energy. And that was very interesting to me because I thought, granted, all these bad things might have happened, but this is an example of a system that works. This is an example of a pocket of an agency that's going horribly awry, and someone blows the whistle, and the IG investigates it, and it's exposed, and they do something about it, and they reprimanded those employees. And I don't know, they might have prosecuted them. I don't know, depending on the laws, but that, at least there's a process for that. Now, I contrast that with the agency, where the same things go on, literally the same things. I mean, just rampant debauchery and alcoholism, and inappropriate relationships, certainly with I'd say often with the targets of our work, which are foreigners, very much akin to this other government example. And nothing ever comes of that. No, you can try to blow the whistle. That's just a complete moot avenue at the agency to try to report wrongdoing to the Inspector General. I've tried to do that, and it's kind of an inside joke that the Inspector General really is not going to do anything with it. And ultimately, you don't really see anything come of wrongdoing within the agency the way you do in other government agencies. And I can only attribute that to the just multiple layers of secrecy, and the fact that they can get away with stuff that splashes across the headlines with other government agencies. You don't do that with the CIA. They throw up the banner of national security and people back off. Right. And it's horrible because that banner protects a lot of wrongdoing. An interesting thing about the Inspector General at the CIA, the Office of the Inspector General, it's in theory supposed to investigate wrongdoing. It does not, and in any meaningful capacity. And what's interesting too is the degree to which it's become politicized. And people didn't seem to take note of this, but I guess it was about a year ago, when General Hayden was the director, he actually investigated the Inspector General, which was pretty much unheard of. And the reason why is the Inspector General, for obvious reasons, is supposed to be independent. And they're supposed to have free rein to do their job, for obvious reasons. The Inspector General had come out with a report about why the agency had produced faulty intelligence leading up to the invasion of Iraq, having to do with weapons of mass destruction. And it was a very critical report. It was unclassified. At least parts of it were. They were published, and it made a lot of employees very angry. And understandably, I mean, no one likes to be criticized.